We're going to be reading from the book of Revelation, chapter 9, but I want to take a look at a couple quick verses before we start. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Why is there none like our God? There is none like him, because he declares the end from the beginning. What is the purpose of prophecy? So God can show us what's going to happen before it happens, and when it happens, we can look back and see his word fulfilled. We can then raise our hands and voices and declare what a God we have. Now let's go to Revelation chapter 9, where we finished off. One woe is past, and behold, there come two woes more hereafter. As we were shown, the book of Revelation is a book written in code or in symbols. We do not take all of this literally, and we do not have to wait thousands of years to see his word fulfilled. We are told these things will shortly come to pass. A whole lot of people say, oh, the book of Revelation will be fulfilled from chapter 4 on. That's somewhere way out in the future after the secret rapture. Well, stop that nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Revelation has been fulfilled progressively from the day John gave it to us until now. In the previous chapter of this book, we saw the fifth trumpet blown. We learned how the Arabs came out of the desert and established an empire. The Byzantine Empire signed a treaty with the Muslims and promised to pay them tribute of so much gold and silver every year if they would just leave them alone. The Muslims made their capital the city of Baghdad, and Baghdad has played a major role in the fulfillment of prophecy ever since. Now it was a great time for the Arabs, and this led to a time of peace. These were the days when the Arabian Night stories were written, and the great Arab leader, Harun al-Rashid, was presiding over this empire, and it was a marvelous time. But you know why God had stopped the ravaging of the Christian empire? Because for a brief period of time, a group of people known as the Isaurian royal family ruled in Constantinople. And do you know what they did? These were Bible Christians, and so the emperor of that day outlawed all graven images throughout the Byzantine Empire. In point of fact, he did not just outlaw them, he had them destroyed. These people were called iconoclasts, which means idol smashers. His supporters went into all the churches and basilicas, and they painted over all the paintings. They broke the statues, and they did away with all the idolatry. And for a brief period of time, which the Isaurian royal family ruled in Constantinople, the Arabs didn't do a thing. There was no violence, there was no judgment, and there were no plagues, and there was no affliction. There was a period of peace and rest, but then the angel prepared again in verse 13 to blow the sixth trumpet. Judgment is coming again. Why? Because a new woman called Empress Irene takes the throne. She calls the Second Council of Nicaea, and she reversed all the positive things the previous rulers had done. She brought back all the idolatry and Babylonish doctrine, and so what remained of the Eastern Empire was once again ripe for judgment. The sixth angel sounded, and I heard from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God. Now there's always a reason for everything that is stated. Why did the voice come from the four corners of the altar that stands before God? It sounds from the altar because it represents the place of intercession, the place of mediatorship, and the place of atonement in Scriptures. All these had been corrupted by the professing Eastern and Western Church of that time. It was about that time that the Roman monk called Robertus had proclaimed the fable of transubstantiation, which is that the bread and wine turns into the actual body and blood of Christ. Now there was always a group that was trying to preach this and bring this into the church, but he was successful. It became the official teaching and the ordinance of the Roman Church, so belief was no longer optional. The biblical ordinance of communion, the simple sharing of bread and wine in remembrance of Jesus Christ, had been corrupted. At the same time, the doctrine of sole mediatorship of Christ had been undermined by the growing worship and prayers addressed to the Virgin Mary and to all the saints. It was at this time that the use of the rosary beads, the 10 Hail Mary prayers to one Lord's Prayer, and repetitious prayers found their way into the so-called Christian Church. And it was in this very era, in 1022 A.D., that the first 14 pre-Reformation Protestants were burned alive in France for denying what Rome calls the real presence or the transformed host wafer. Judgment is coming again, and the sixth trumpet begins to sound, saying to the six angels which had the trumpet, Loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. In the last chapter, the first woes arose in Arabia with Muhammad. This trumpet blast and the second woe began. This woe originated in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the region of modern-day Iraq where the city of Baghdad stands, which was the center of the Islamic Caliphate at that time. Who are the 4 angels? They are 4 demon spirits, just as we learned in the last chapter. Apollyon, also known as Abaddon, inspired Muhammad to write the Quran and start his false religion. These are 4 demon spirits. The mystic number 4 is very important, and it is taken as the base of governmental hierarchy in Islam in honor of the 4 angels who carried the Quran and the 4 caliphs who were disciples of Muhammad. What did we learn from the last chapter regarding the Quran? It was full of smoke, corruption, and false doctrines that came from the bottomless pit, and it spread over the land. So here are the 4 demon spirits, and why are they set loose? So they can bring judgment and destruction upon corrupted and apostate Christendom. Now the inhabitants of Baghdad and the Arabs had gotten themselves a little bit soft and flabby. The caliph found himself in a bit of a predicament, so he did as many have done throughout history. He hired mercenaries. He hired a people known today as the Turks. Now these tribes were Muslim, and they embraced Islam, but they were not so civilized. They were even more warlike than the Arabs. The caliph sent for them, and they became his mercenary troops under the command of Tughril Beg, who was declared to be the protector and the governor of the Islamic Empire. And in no time at all, Tughril Beg unleashed his host of troops, and thousands of them invaded the Eastern Roman Empire. Soon he was defeating them and driving them back. Thousands of Greeks were killed, both by Tughril Beg and his successor, Alp Arslan, which means valiant lion. You will see the significance of this in a moment. Now the angels are loosed, and they are to kill a third part of men. And the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, for to slay the third part of men. By these 3 was the third part of men killed, by the fire, and by the smoke, and by the brimstone, which issued out of their mouths. The third part is just the remaining in the third part of the Roman Empire. It was the area of Turkey, Constantinople, Greece, Yugoslavia, and surrounding areas. This part, or the third part of the Roman Empire, was to be destroyed by the Turks acting as the agents of God's judgment. It does not refer to a third part of everybody being killed somewhere out there in the future after you've all been raptured away. It does not refer to this at all. This refers, in point of fact, to a historical event where the third part of the Roman Empire was destroyed. Now the Spirit of God never ceases to amaze me. It never ceases to amaze me how accurate the Spirit of God is when He's describing something. How are the Turks described? And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000. And I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire, and of jacinth, and brimstone. And the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire, and smoke, and brimstone. For the power is in their mouth, and in their tails. For their tails were like unto serpents, and had heads, and with them they do hurt. Now let's look at something for a minute. That is a strange expression in verse 16. 200,000. Now I usually don't read anything else but the Authorized King James Version of the Bible. But if you read a revised version of the Scripture, it renders this verse twice 10,000 times 10,000. You know how the Turks in history organized their armies. They organized them in units of 10,000 men. Now how do you think John, a little man, sitting imprisoned on a rocky barren island in the middle of nowhere in 96 AD, was going to know to write it down that these people coming 900 years later would be organized in groups of 10,000? He didn't know. He wasn't just making it up or pulling it out of the air. He didn't hear it from Nostradamus or the psychic hotline. The Spirit of God revealed it to him. The book of Revelation is what it means. It's an open book. The word apocalypse means unveiling or uncovering. 10,000 times 10,000, and he heard the noise of their hooves. He saw wave upon wave of cavalry bearing down on their enemy. The Turks were famous for their cavalry and riding hard into battle, thousands at a time.